One morning, you wake up and realize you have nothing to say. Not because you're tired or sad, because the conversations you used to live for suddenly feel like they're happening in a language you no longer speak. You're sitting with people you've known for years, people you love, people who shaped you, and you feel a distance forming that has nothing to do with anger or resentment. Something inside you shifted while nobody was watching, and now you're standing in the middle of your own life feeling like a stranger who somehow ended up at the wrong table. Carl Jung studied this phenomenon for decades, and what he found shook even him. He discovered that the most painful phase of psychological development isn't the breakdown. It isn't the confrontation with your shadow or the collapse of your false self. The most agonizing stage is what comes after you've done that work. The phase where you've genuinely changed, but everything and everyone around you hasn't. Jung called this the individuation crisis, and he observed that more people abandon their awakening at this stage than at any other. Not because the growth was too hard, because the loneliness of having grown was unbearable. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered happens when you outgrow the people around you, why this phase feels like grief even though nobody died, the specific psychological mechanics that make this loneliness so devastating, and what Jung found on the other side for people who refuse to shrink back down to fit. To understand what's happening, you need to see it the way Jung saw it when patients arrived at his office during this exact phase. They weren't depressed in the traditional sense. They were dislocated. They described feeling invisible in their own relationships, feeling like they were watching their life from behind glass, feeling desperately alone while surrounded by people who claimed to love them. And when Jung looked closely, he realized something that changed his entire approach. These people hadn't lost connection with others. They had gained connection with themselves. And that self-connection had made their old relational patterns impossible to sustain. The friendships built on shared complaints no longer worked because they'd stopped complaining and started changing. The family dynamics held together by unspoken rules fell apart because they could no longer pretend the rules made sense. The romantic relationships sustained by codependence became suffocating because they had learned to breathe on their own. Nothing external had changed. Everything internal had. And the gap between the two was tearing their world apart. Jung found that this phase begins with a specific internal experience he described as the death of resonance. Before your awakening, you resonated naturally with the people in your life. You shared the same frequency, the same assumptions about what mattered, what was normal, what conversations were worth having. You bonded over shared wounds, shared complaints, shared unconsciousness. And that resonance felt like intimacy because you didn't know the difference. Then you started doing the work. You faced your shadow. You stopped running from yourself. You integrated parts of your psyche that had been fragmented since childhood. And somewhere in that process, your frequency changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough that the resonance with your old world started dissolving like a radio station, slowly drifting out of range. The first thing you notice is that conversations feel hollow. You're sitting with your closest friend and they're telling you about the same problem they've been describing for 3 years. The same relationship pattern, the same complaint about their job, the same story with different details, and you feel something you've never felt with this person before. Boredom, not cruelty, not judgment, just the quiet recognition that you've moved somewhere they haven't followed, and the distance between you is now audible in every sentence. You still care about them, That's what makes it so confusing. Love doesn't leave, but resonance does. And without resonance, love becomes this painful thing you hold while standing on opposite sides of a widening canyon. Jung documented that patients in this phase consistently reported guilt as their dominant emotion. Not sadness, not anger. Guilt. Because they felt responsible for the distance. Because they'd been taught that good people stay connected, that loyalty means proximity, that growth should bring you closer to people, not further away. And when their transformation created distance instead of closeness, they concluded something was wrong with them, that they'd become cold or selfish or spiritually arrogant. That real growth should make you more available to everyone, not less available to people who haven't done their own work. Jung was fierce about correcting this belief. He told his patients that guilt about outgrowing people was the ego's last attempt to keep you small. It disguised itself as compassion and humility, but it was really just fear wearing a moral costume. Fear that if you fully inhabit who you've become, you'll lose everyone. Fear that your authentic self is too much, too different, too inconvenient for the people you love. Fear that the loneliness of growth will be permanent. And so, the guilt whispers, go back, shrink down. Pretend you haven't changed. At least you won't be alone. But Jung observed something critical about people who listened to that guilt. They did go back. They did shrink. They did pretend. And it destroyed them in ways that outgrowing people never could. Because once you've seen clearly, performing blindness isn't just uncomfortable. It's a betrayal of your own psyche, so fundamental that it creates depression, anxiety, physical illness, and eventually a rage that has no appropriate target, because the person you're really angry at is yourself for choosing belonging over truth. Here's where Jung's framework becomes essential. He discovered that when you outgrow your environment, 4 specific psychological processes happen simultaneously, and understanding them is the difference between navigating this phase with wisdom and being consumed by it. The first process is projection withdrawal. Before your awakening, you projected parts of yourself onto the people around you. You saw your own potential in friends who never pursued theirs. You projected your need for safety onto family members who couldn't actually provide it. You placed your longing for depth onto partners who operated entirely on the surface. These projections kept you attached because you weren't relating to real people. You were relating to the parts of yourself you distributed among them. When you start integrating those projected parts, when you reclaim your potential, your need for safety, your capacity for depth, the projections dissolve, and suddenly you're seeing people as they actually are, not as the vessels you needed them to be. This is disorienting. The friend you thought understood you deeply might actually be someone who just reflected your words back without comprehension. The family member you relied on might be someone whose support was conditional on you staying small. The partner you believed was your equal might be someone who needed your light because they refused to find their own. Jung emphasized that this isn't about the other people being bad. It's about your projections clearing and reality becoming visible. They haven't changed. You're just finally seeing them without the filter of what you needed them to be. And that clarity, while necessary, is a specific kind of heartbreak that feels like discovering your house was never as solid as you believed. The second process is what Jung called energetic incompatibility. Your psychological growth doesn't just change your thoughts and behaviors. It changes your entire energetic field. The things that used to stimulate you now drain you. The chaos that once felt exciting now feels exhausting. The drama that used to engage you now repels you. And the people who operate at frequencies you've outgrown become literally uncomfortable to be around. Not because they're toxic, because your systems are no longer compatible. This is why you start canceling plans without understanding why. Why you feel relieved when events get canceled. Why spending time with certain people leaves you feeling depleted in a way that has nothing to do with whether they're good or bad people. Your nervous system has recalibrated through your inner work, and it now registers incompatible frequencies as stress. You're not being antisocial. Your body is telling you what your mind hasn't fully accepted yet. You've outgrown environments that were once home. 2 down, 2 to go. And the next 2 are the ones that explain why this phase hurts in ways you can't describe to anyone who hasn't lived it. But before we get there, I want you to know that the True Self-Discovery Guide exists for people standing in exactly this gap. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, not to pull you back to who you were, but to help you hold steady while the old frequency fades and the new one hasn't locked in yet. It's in the description. The third process Jung identified is what he called the mirror crisis. Every relationship serves as a mirror reflecting back to you who you are. When you're unconscious, you seek mirrors that confirm your wounds. Friends who validate your victimhood. Partners who reenact your childhood dynamics. Family systems that reinforce the role you were assigned. These mirrors feel comfortable because they reflect a version of yourself you recognize, even if that version is suffering. When you grow, you need different mirrors. You need people who reflect your wholeness back to you, not your wounds. People who see your strength, not just your sensitivity. People who challenge you to keep expanding rather than people who need you to stay the same, so they feel comfortable. And when you look around your current life and realize that most of your mirrors are still reflecting the old you, the version you've worked so hard to outgrow, you feel a desperation that's hard to articulate. You're becoming someone no one in your life can see. And being unseen by everyone you know is a particular kind of solitary confinement that happens in plain sight. Jung found this mirror crisis is what drives many people back into unconsciousness. The need to be reflected, to be recognized, to have someone look at you and see who you're actually becoming is so primal that people will abandon their growth just to feel seen again. They'll dumb themselves down, play small, pretend they haven't changed, anything to get the mirrors working again, even if those mirrors are showing a lie. The fourth process is grief without death. You're mourning people who are still alive. You're grieving relationships that technically still exist. You're experiencing loss without the clean finality that death provides. And because nobody has actually died or left, you feel like you don't have permission to grieve. People don't bring casseroles when you outgrow your best friend. There's no funeral for the version of your family you needed them to be. No support group for losing a partner who's still sitting across from you at dinner, but might as well be on a different planet. Jung recognized this as disenfranchised grief, a mourning that society doesn't acknowledge or validate. And he found it was one of the most psychologically damaging forms of loss because it had no resolution. You couldn't move through it the way you move through death because the person was still there, still calling, still expecting the version of you that no longer existed to show up and perform. The grief just recycled endlessly, triggered every time you saw the distance between who they thought you were and who you'd actually become. These four processes happening simultaneously Create the experience that people in this phase describe with the same word over and over. Alone. Not lonely in the simple sense of wanting company. Alone in the existential sense of having no one who can see what's actually happening to you. Of standing in a room full of people who love a version of you that's already dead and not knowing how to tell them. Of carrying the weight of your own transformation without anyone to witness it. Jung found that this aloneness, as devastating as it is, serves an essential psychological purpose. It strips away every external source of identity, every relationship that told you who you were, every role that gave you meaning, every mirror that reflected a self you should recognize. It takes all of it, and it leaves you standing with nothing but yourself, not the version of yourself others need, not the role your family assigned, not the persona your social circle rewards, just you, raw, undefined by anyone else's perception, terrifyingly free. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming individual, undivided from yourself, whole unto yourself in a way that doesn't require anyone else's recognition or validation to be real. And he was honest that the price of individuation is steep. You lose the comfort of belonging to a group identity. You lose the ease of relationships built on shared unconsciousness. You lose the simple pleasure of fitting in without effort. You pay for wholeness with the currency of everything that used to make you feel safe. But Jung also documented what happens to people who survive this phase, who sat in the aloneness without running back, who tolerated being unseen without shrinking to become visible again, who grieved their old world without trying to resurrect it. Something extraordinary emerged on the other side, not immediately, not painlessly, but inevitably for those who stayed the course. They developed what Jung called sovereign presence, an ability to be fully themselves without apology, without performance, without adjusting to make others comfortable. They stopped seeking mirrors in every relationship because they'd learned to see themselves clearly without external reflection. They stopped needing resonance with everyone because they'd found resonance within. They stopped performing old versions of themselves because the energy required for that performance was no longer available. It had been redirected towards something more honest. And then something unexpected happened. New people appeared, not the kind of people they'd spent their life surrounded by, different ones. People who had also done their own work. People who could see them clearly because they'd learned to see clearly themselves. People who didn't need them to be small or simple or easily digestible. These connections felt nothing like the old ones. They were quieter, less dramatic, built on mutual wholeness rather than mutual wounds. And they were more sustaining than anything the old world had ever provided. Jung warned that this doesn't happen on your timeline. You can't rush new connections into existence by wanting them desperately. The period between releasing the old world and finding the new one is the wilderness. And the wilderness has no map, no guarantees, no estimated arrival time. You just walk. You tolerate the silence. You trust that the same growth that made the old world impossible is building you for a new world you can't yet see. This is the part that breaks most people. The wilderness period, the in-between, the space where you've left the shore you knew but haven't reached the one you're swimming toward. Everything in your psychology screams to go back. Your attachment system activates. Your abandonment wounds flare. Your inner child throws a tantrum because it chose growth and got loneliness, and nobody warned it that this was part of the deal. Jung would tell you that the wilderness isn't punishment for growing. It's the necessary space between who you were and who you're becoming, like the darkness between letting go of one trapeze bar and catching the next. You're not falling, you're in transit, but it feels like falling because nothing is holding you and the ground looks very far away. What Jung found most significant was this: the people who made it through the wilderness didn't do it by being strong. They did it by being honest. Honest about the grief, honest about the fear, honest about missing their old life, even as they recognized they could never go back to it. They let themselves feel all of it without using the feelings as justification to retreat. They acknowledge that outgrowing everyone you love is devastating, and they grew anyway. Not because they didn't care, because they understood, maybe for the first time, that the most caring thing they could do for anyone, including themselves, was to stop pretending to be someone they had already outgrown. If you're in this phase right now, if you're feeling the distance forming and the guilt rising and the aloneness settling into your bones like weather, Jung would tell you something you desperately need to hear. You're not losing people. You're finding yourself. And those two things in this phase feel identical. The grief is real. The loneliness is real. The fear that you'll never belong anywhere again is real. But what's also real is that you're becoming someone who doesn't need to shrink to belong. Someone who doesn't need shared unconsciousness to feel connected. Someone who can stand in their own wholeness, even when no one around them can see it yet. That's the awakening phase nobody talks about. Not the mystical experiences or the expanded awareness or the spiritual downloads. The part where you sit alone at your own kitchen table, wondering if growth was worth the price. And slowly, painfully, with no fanfare and no audience, deciding it was. Because the alternative, going back to sleep in a life you've already woken up from, isn't really an alternative at all. It's just a slower, quieter way of losing yourself, and you've already done that. You've already spent years being someone you weren't, so that everyone else could be comfortable. This loneliness, this devastating aloneness, is actually the first honest thing you've felt in a long time. And honesty, even when it hurts this much, is what the whole journey has been about. You'll find your people, not the ones who need you to perform, the ones who can sit with you in the silence and recognize what you've survived to become. They're out there. They're looking for you too. And when you find each other, you'll understand why the old world had to fall apart. Not because it was wrong, because you outgrew it. And outgrowing something is not betrayal. It's the most natural thing a living being can do. Jung knew that. And now so do you. The old world didn't fall apart because something went wrong. It fell apart because you outgrew it. And the True Self-Discovery Guide was written for the space between that falling apart and what comes next. 24 exercises to help you stand in your own wholeness while the new world finds its way to you. It's in the description whenever you're ready.